Welcome back, guys. So in this video, we are going to configure the Cognito, which is the key component in setting up the authentication for the Lambda function. And just for the Cognito perspective, AWS Cognito is a very enriched service which provides us all kind of authentication capabilities that includes to use the username and password. Even without username and password, we can use the JWT token, and the authentication has been embedded in as part of the request, and we don't need username and password. We normally use the client ID and client credential. It also support the federation authentication model, where you can delegate your authentication to the external authentication services. For example, if you want to use the Google or Facebook or any external identity provider, and that will replicate the authentication on the Cognito end, which will used by the service for the validation of the incoming request. So there are a bunch of options available in AWS Cognito. Tell you the truth, Cognito itself require a full course. That's how enriched this is. But in this demo, what we're gonna do, we will use the client credential-based authentication, which is, I believe, the most secure way to validate the API calls. And I'm going to show you how we can do it. Obviously, we need to add an additional service into our architecture just to fully secure it, but I'm not going to discuss it at this stage. Right now, what we are going to do at this step, we'll set up the AWS Cognito to authenticate our API request. So by saying it, let's jump back into the AWS environment. And like I mentioned, if the service is not displayed on your dashboard, you can simply type spell Cognito, and let me just open it in a new tab. Let me hide my control so I can see I have the the Cognito services. And like I mentioned, each service has its standard page where AWS provide you the general information, getting started section. If you want to learn this service and start playing with it, it's the starting page is really a good starting point for us. So let me quickly go to user pool, because generally for the API authentication, we use the user pool because that will allow us to set up the user base authentication. Identity pool generally use the authentication between the AWS services, so which is not going to be the use case in the current scenario. And I'll see if I can create a use case for the identity pools in later videos. Now, the very first step, we are going to create a user pool. So let's start. And look, you can see again, it is giving me error that I don't have access, failed to get SES configuration set, which is fine. Like I mentioned, I can fix it. So what I'll do, I'll just fix it and we'll resume from there. Okay, now you can see the error has gone. I have fixed the permission, and like I mentioned in the first video, we always prefer to give minimum permission, and if we face any failure or permission issue, we fix it. But it's always a best practice to keep the permission minimum for every user. Obviously, the admins are excluded in this rule. So we are going to use the we are going to set up the Cognito user pool, and the sign in option. I'm not going to use any sign in, because we programmatically generate the token and set this token as part of the API. So that is not relevant in this scenario. Okay, let's just use the username. And let me just click next. I'm going to use the default password. So by the way, we can set up all the rules for the password. Because Cognito User Pool is a generic interface, so it provides all the options whether you are going to use them or not. So you can see we are not going to use the username, but we have to select the username. Also, we are not going to use the password because that's the best part of the Cognito, that we are skipping the username and password to flow or even to be used by our Lambda function during the authentication. So that will remove all the possibility of leaking up the user and password due to some fault or due to some mistake. So that's the core concept of using Cognito client credential, right? But obviously the interface is generic, so that's why you have to select this option. But tell you the truth, we are not going to use password anywhere. We don't need multi-factor authentication. Like I mentioned, we are not using the username and password. Our authentication method will be very different. We are not going to do any user account recovery. So you can see we have just used the default in this screen. And let me just click next. I'm not going to set up the self-service sign-up, but tell you something in one of the Cognito video. What I'll do, I'll just show you how you can set up all the screen if you really want to give the user the experience so they can set up their account, and then after setting up their account, they can get the JWT token through the proper user registration method, like using the username and password, which is, I believe, is a less, I would say, secure way, because we still have the possibility to release that username and password, or just that username and password has been exposed to the external world. There's still a risk if the devs don't care of it during the development. So that's why I'm not going to that track. But just from your understanding perspective, we will do one demo for the username and password as well through the Cognito. All right, so Cognito sign, we are not sending any messages. We don't need any additional attribute, and we don't need any custom attribute at this stage. So you can see these are all part of the user profile that needs to be set it up as part of the authentication within the AWS Cognito. And I'm not so I think I'm good. I'm send email, although it's again not relevant because we are not sending any email. Generally what happened, once you configure your user in the user pool in AWS Cognito, it send an email to your registered account, so you need to verify that email address. If you don't it, that's not going to actually validate your profile until unless you click it and you make sure that the email has been confirmed. And you can see that that's part of the general practice these days, that once you register yourself on a system, it will validate the legitimacy of the email address. So same concept in here, but like I mentioned, we are not going through that route, so that is not relevant. That's why I just kept it default. So I'm not going to change anything, and let me just hit next. Okay, what if I just do that? Yeah, let me just use send email with Cognito, and I can again put a dummy address, and I want to put just a dummy address just to show you that it is not applicable in this case. So you can see I'm using both address as a dummy just to bypass through this screen. All right, so my username pool is going to be step a AG user pool demo. I'm not going to hosted UI. I'm going to use the public client because client is the application which has the configuration that we're gonna later use to extract the token. And we have three types of client. We are going to use the public because obviously the once the API is public, that means the user can be anywhere in the world and they can initiate the call to your API, and the token needs to be issued from the Cognito service, right? So that's why our client application needs to be public as well in this particular scenario. But if we just want to use it within our local environment, obviously we can go towards the confidential client, which is obviously not going to be accessible from the internet or external to our network. So same, let me just copy the client name as well, AG, just call it client demo, right? And I'm going to generate the secret. Generally, we keep the client ID and client secret in the SSM or the system management services, which generally keep all the sensitive information. And what you can do, you can, while you are calling or you are working with the Lambda function, so you can extract that information from the security parameter, secure parameters, or or KMS or any other wall type service which AWS is providing. So that's the best way to secure, because the dev doesn't need to know where the information has been stored and how it has been stored. All they need to call that service to get the data from this service. So that's why once we generate it, at the very last demo, we'll see how we can secure that information into the secure service and extract it back into the Lambda function. So I think we are all good at this stage. I'm just keeping the step simple because later on we come back and we'll just configure it. So I think we come on to the last screen, review. Yeah, we are good. No MFA, no user recovery, password policy is default. And let me see. Yeah, authentication token. The life is 30 days. We can change it later on. That's not a, sorry, access token expiration is 60 minutes. After 60 minutes, the token will expire and we need to request for a new token. And these are all by the way, don't confuse with these attributes. That is just for the internal mechanics. It has nothing to do with the actual mechanics of the Cognito authentication. It just has these attributes which you can be used through the Cognito services, or you can just ignore them. It's more like for someone who wants to set up a full-fledged, authentication method within the Cognito through the user pool, which is not the case in here. So I think we are good. Let's create the user pool. So we have the user pool created, which is good. Now what I'm doing, I'm going to capture a couple of some of the information which we'll use in the later steps, which the very first one is the user pool name. I have the other screen. Let me just copy it on the other screen. The ARN. I think we are good. So you can see we don't have any user information. We don't have any group. Sign-in experience, we haven't configured it, so we don't need it. Sign-up experience, we haven't configured because again, that is not relevant. Messaging, we are not sending any emails. So I just kept the dummy account. Now, the main area that needs to be configured to to use the client credential based authentication is the app integration. And now we need to pay close attention, because first we need to create a domain. So there are two types of domain in this scenario. We are going to create the Cognito based domain, and you can see the URL is based on the Cognito. Obviously, we can go and we can create the custom domain, which is generally a case in most of the enterprises. But AWS provide another option where they embed their own URL into the domain that we need to set it up. If we don't want to fully use the customer, we don't want to use the fully customizable domain, we can still go and leverage the AWS based domain. So all we need to do, just need to put the domain name. So let me see what I'm going to do. I'm just going to call it AG AG calculation. Right, so that you can put any name, that name to be unique. So you can see it is available agcalculation.auth. Your region name dot amazoncognito.com. So let me hit. So now I have this domain available. Let me copy that as well. Now, I'm also going to create a resource server, which obviously we need to set it up for the auth 2.0 authentication in the JWT token. So that particular part we need it for we need it for configuring the JWT authentication, and later I'm going to show you where it generally used as part of the configuration. The source server, don't be confused with any sort of server. We just need to provide the name of the resource server, and that is more like, you know, part of the internal mechanism, how Cognito use it to authenticate the upcoming token from the API. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to call it AAG. Let's say AG demo server, right? Or AG demo resource server. I think that's better. And I need to create a scope. And scope, I can say that stat calculations, because I'm only using the statistical calculation. I just want to authenticate those API calls which are part of my stat calculation Lambda function. So I'm just using the scope stat calculation. I'm not going to use that scope in the anywhere in the API gateway. These are all the general setting that we need to set it up as part of the client credential. But generally we don't use them. It's not going to impact until unless we want to scope the API but based on this scope. We can still do, like, if we have many function behind our API and we just need to provide different scope to different functions behind the API, we can do it. So you can see how we can move from simple to most complicated scenario using a single screen. So that's where I'm saying it's a bit complicated in a way that everything has been embedded into one sort of wizard. That's where sometimes it's really confusing. So if you don't understand the concept of resource server, or I would say scope, just keep in mind we just need to provide some sort of values which is going to later used by internally the user pool service. So let's create the resource server. Let me just use the same identifier. I'm just going to I'm going to call it statistics calculation, and now we are good. Okay, our domain is done. Our resource server has been configured. We are not going to use hosted UI. Security, we are good. We are not going to set it up the advanced security. And now you can see that that's another one, a most important one, where we have the client, because that client part, it has the client ID and the client secret, which we normally use to send to AWS Cognito to issue the JWT token. So you can see this client app has been created as part of the user pool configuration. And if I click on it, you can see we have the client ID, which I have copied it. Also, generally, it won't show you the client secret, but if we just click on that button, we have this client secret. Now, that client secret will remain static. It won't change. So that's why I'm saying we generally keep it into the secure service area for our AWS infrastructure, and generally dev or developers get that secret programmatically. And don't need to mention, we have a separate values for our dev, pre-prod and prod environment. All right, so I think this part is all good from this side. Let me just see if I need to. Yeah, so the last part that we need to configure before we complete the AWS Cognito service is doing the hosted UI. And hosted UI has multiple options. And again, like I mentioned, this part is also shared between user-based authentication or user and password-based JWT token issue, or also the client credential-based JWT token issue. So some values you need to configure, and some values you can leave them as it is. So what we are going to do, we are going to use we are not going to use identity provider. All we need to select the client credential, because that's something we need to do. And you can see why we set it up the scope. So without that scope configuration, we are unable to select the client credential, because scope internally and that resource server internally used by Cognito to issue the JWT token. And you can see the scope that I have set it up previously is display in here. So I think we are all good with this as well. Let me copy that scope in here. And I think that's the last step. Let's save it. And that's it. Now we have our user pool configured successfully. So you can see in here the user pool is there. And now the next step is to set up our API gateway or APIs, or integrate it with the Cognito, so we can see if we can generate the JWT token to validate API call, or if we try to call the API without JWT token, the call should be failed and it should give us the unauthorized message, because now we are calling the API without sending the authentication information as part of the API. So that's pretty much it. Hopefully, it will be beneficial to understand the concept of Cognito. And I believe you like it. Please feel free to put any comment if you have any question. Otherwise, stay tuned for the next video, where we're gonna see the integration of Cognito and the API gateway. Thanks for watching.